Recently, we've been talking about the values of suffering. We spent a lot of time on that, and I'm going to spend some more time tonight on it because I hope that we'll really pay attention to this area of study and realize that all suffering is not bad. There are many values in suffering, and they can help us to be better people, better prepared for heaven. As we closed last week, we were talking about a lady who had suffered greatly. You remember the story of Jane McWhorter, who had a terrible wreck, and her head was cracked in at least 200 places. She suffered greatly, and her husband also suffered, of course, because of all of the things that she was going through. Her husband, Don McWhorter, wrote an article, 2-page article, entitled, Why? And of course, that's the question we've been asking and studying. And he's asking, why did these things happen to Jane? He wrote about 9 lessons they had learned from that experience. I don't believe that Jane or Don would have said that wreck was good. It was a good thing. Not at all. But they could say that there were many lessons that came from it that were good. They saw the hand of God, the providence of God in working through all of that. And they were blessed abundantly because of God's love and concern for them. And he wrote this article listing 9 things they had learned through that experience. Now, I believe that they learned a great deal that helped them prepare for heaven. I was talking with Brother David Hester after class last week, and I learned from him that he knew these folks personally. They were good friends of his parents. He was in school with their son. He had known them well for a long time, and I think he concurs with me that these people were good people, and in all probability, the things they learned from that suffering helped prepare them for that journey which they have now taken. Both of them have now crossed over the river of death to the other shore, and I am confident that the things they learned from this experience helped prepare them for that journey, and I'm confident that God walked with them through that valley of the shadow of death. And it's an illustration of the fact that we can learn from these things that happen to us, and that we ought never to try to get God to remove all of the suffering that we experience. Because as an aftermath of suffering, we can see God's providential care, we can see His love for us, and we see the fulfillment of the promise in Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. And so we need to have our eyes open to the fact that there are blessings in suffering and look for those blessings. Suffering is a reminder of God's presence and His love. Now, suffering is a reminder of God's presence. He's always with us, but sometimes we forget it. But when you get into trouble, then you can be reminded of it. Suffering builds character and strength. In the book of 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter talks about this very thing. Let me read that verse to you. Listen carefully to it. 1 Peter 5:10. But the God of all grace, who hath called us unto His eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. Now notice those last few words again. After that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. Peter is saying that these sufferings that we experience in life can help us. They can help us to become perfect in God's sight. Some of the world's greatest people and most successful people are those who have come through suffering. Now, I believe that one of the most amazing stories that I've ever heard outside the Bible is the story of Helen Keller. She was born up here in the Tri-Cities area, Florence, Tuscumbia, Sheffield, right in that area. When she was 19 months old, she contacted some sort of disease, and they all thought that she was going to die. But somehow she lived through it. But that disease robbed her of 2 of the most precious gifts, her sight and her hearing. She couldn't see, she couldn't hear. And I have wondered how in the world she'd ever learn anything. Both of the doors into the mind through which we gain enlightenment were closed from the time she was 19 months old. She became like a wild animal, and they thought they were going to have to put her into some sort of institution after a while, but they didn't want to do that. And finally, they found someone who said she could teach her. Mackie and I watched a movie on TV last week, and it was a movie about this very thing. It's called The Miracle Worker. It was not a miracle in the biblical sense, but it was an amazing thing. We watched through that movie on TV. It was on Netflix. And there are 2 or 3 that are entitled The Miracle Worker. We watched one and started to watch another and found out it was the same story, but they just had different actors. They must have tried to update it some way. But it's the story of how Annie Sullivan taught that little baby. Well, she'd already grown up several years by the time she got to her. And it's an amazing thing that she was ever able to teach her. I still don't understand how she could teach that girl who could not see and could not hear. But she did it. And Helen Keller became one of the world's greatest personalities, great character, great person, a great ambassador for the United States. Now, she overcame great adversity, and it's still amazing how she was able to be taught. But it indicates the fact that we can have some sort of problem like that, and we can overcome it, and we can become better people. It can contribute to our strength and our preparation for heaven. Suffering opens doors of opportunity for other people to help us, and for us to help other people, and for God to help us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, Paul tells us that God is the God of all comfort. Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble, by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. God is our comforter. He comforts us, and He gives a reason for it, that we may be able to comfort others. It opens doors of opportunity for God to comfort us and for us to comfort other people. You know, if God comforts us for us to comfort others, if we comfort other people, it might motivate them to try to comfort others and be concerned about other people. The Bible teaches that we have a responsibility to comfort one another. Wherefore, comfort ye one another. There are different ways in which we can do that, but there is always the opportunity when we see somebody else who is in trouble. When I was preaching for the Avondale Church in Atlanta, we had a program in which we would look in the paper and find who had lost a loved one, and we would send them a little booklet. We often use that little 20th century Christian booklet entitled, Wherefore Comfort Ye One Another. And we'd send it to those folks who had lost a loved one in the hopes that it would encourage and help them. On one occasion, a man visited our services one Sunday, and I went out to see him, as I usually did when somebody came to visit with us. And in talking with him, I found that he was one of those who had lost a loved one, lost his wife, and we had sent him one of these little booklets. And he said, I wanted to go see who these people are who were concerned about us and tried to comfort us and sent us that little book. It opened a door of opportunity for us to tell them about Jesus. It can happen that way. If someone is in trouble, if we try to comfort them, it can open a door of opportunity to tell them about the Lord. And so suffering opens doors of opportunity for us. Now, there are a number of things that we can learn from this matter of suffering, and we have indicated several of them, but I want to mention some more tonight. We need to remember the values of suffering. That's the very point we're trying to make. We need to remember that there are values in suffering. I have mentioned Psalm 119, verse 71, where the psalmist said, it is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. The psalmist had suffered, and that suffering had caused him to turn to the Lord and to learn God's will, God's statutes. And the same thing can happen to us. We can learn some things if we would just open our hearts to God and let Him help us. It helps us to learn valuable lessons in life. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 32, and the surrounding passages, the Bible tells us about Nebuchadnezzar. You remember that Babylonian king and the fact that he was filled with pride. He looked out over his dominion. He talked about what I have done, what I have accomplished, and so on. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? You see, he's filled with pride. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Nebuchadnezzar was made to go out and eat grass like an animal. And then the next verse says, The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So Nebuchadnezzar was brought down to his knees, made to eat grass like an oxen, because he was filled with pride. And he suffered for it. And that caused him to realize there is a God in heaven. Now, one of the lessons we can learn from suffering is the fact that we don't need to be filled with pride. When we begin to be filled with pride and then we suffer, we're brought down, we can see we need God. The Apostle Paul was one who suffered a great deal. Now, I'm not going to read that list that he gives us in 2 Corinthians 11, beginning with verse 23. We want to get to that later. But you remember the suffering that Paul experienced. You remember all the things he had accomplished and the fact that he received great revelations from God. And there's a possibility that he could have been filled with pride. And he had that thorn in the flesh. He prayed to God about it 3 times, asking God to remove it. But God said no every time. And there was a reason for it. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, Paul said, And lest I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. God said, no, I'm not going to remove that thing, and Paul knew why. It was to keep him humble. God allowed him to be afflicted with that, whatever it was, and it kept him humble. It kept him from thinking, I'm great and powerful. He couldn't do anything about that thing. He was still dependent upon God. So suffering sometimes helps us to overcome pride. It helps us to realize we need God. Suffering opens a lot of doors to us to learn different things. And that one, I think, is one of the greatest lessons we need to learn. We need God. We can't take care of ourselves. We can't handle it alone. Now, there are other things that it does for us. As we talked about the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was brought to his knees, and Paul also was brought to his knees and realized that he needed God. But also it opened the ears of Manasseh. A few months ago, when the Thursday morning class was studying the minor prophets Tim Garkowicz was teaching the class, and he came across Manasseh, one of the kings, and the fact that his suffering caused him to open his ears. Sometimes it can do that. Sometimes we won't open our ears to God until something happens to us. And that was true of Manasseh. Oftentimes we're not willing to listen until something bad happens to us. Have you ever known someone who needed to turn back to God, and you thought something bad is going to have to happen to him before he ever does that? Sometimes that's true. Sometimes some suffering has to come upon a person before he will open his ears and listen to God. And we see many cases like that all around us. It opened the ears of Manasseh. And there was a wayward church member and family who were away from the Lord. And I want to read a story to you that was written by Leroy Brownlow. Leroy Brownlow was a great gospel preacher, and many of us have heard him preach, and many of us have some of the books that he has written. He was a great preacher. He used to preach for the largest congregation in our brotherhood west of the Mississippi River. I had an opportunity to see him there a few years ago because my son-in-law, Scott Gleaves, was preaching for the congregation where Brother Brownlow was worshiping as a retired man. That was the one where he used to preach. It had become smaller after that, but he was there and had an opportunity to see him on that occasion. I ran across this story. Leroy Brownlow tells a story about a family of wayward church members, a father and 3 sons, once active but now indifferent. They have been visited by the preacher and elders. Everything within reason had been done to restore them, all in vain. One day while working, a large rattlesnake bit John, one of the sons. The doctor was summoned and pronounced his condition grave. He observed that about the only thing left was prayer. Immediately the preacher and elders were called. The preacher was asked to pray for John's recovery. He did, sort of. This is his prayer. Pay careful attention to his prayer. O wise and righteous Father, we thank thee that thou hast, in thy wisdom, sent this rattlesnake to bite John in order to bring him to his senses. He has not been inside the church house for years, and it is very doubtful that he has in all this time, until now, felt any need for prayer. Now we trust that this will prove a valuable lesson to him, and that it may lead to genuine repentance. And now, O Father, wilt thou send another rattlesnake to bite Sam, and another to bite Jim, and another big one to bite the old man? We have been doing everything we know for years to restore them, but to no avail. It seems, therefore, that with all our combined efforts could do no good, this rattlesnake has done. We thus conclude that the only thing left that will do this family any good is rattlesnakes. So, Lord, send us bigger and better rattlesnakes. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, I can't vouch for the truthfulness of that story, but it teaches a good point, I think. Sometimes suffering will cause a person to open his ears and sit up and take notice concerning his status in life and his need to turn to God. It may be that we need some rattlesnakes. We need something to cause us to open our ears to God's will. Affliction, then, sometimes can help us. Affliction is sometimes just a stepping stone to success. I read a story about a little girl that was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and she and her older brother were climbing up the side of a mountain, and it was rough going. After a while, the little girl said to her brother, "Let's turn around and go back down. This is just rocks and bumps." And her brother said, "The bumps are the things you climb on." I have a book in my library written by Warren Wiersbe with that title, "The Bumps Are the Things You Climb On." Sometimes that's true in regard to these problems in life. Sometimes those are the things that help us. We can climb on those things and become better people and do better things. Sometimes affliction is the key to success. Do you remember the Apostle Paul's statement to the Philippian brethren along this line? You remember the suffering of Paul, how he had been stoned and left for dead at Lystra, how he had been thrown into prison after being beaten in Philippi when he cast that spirit out of that young girl. You remember that he was arrested for preaching Christ, and then he went to Rome to stand before Caesar because he had been unjustly arrested and so on. Remember his suffering when he crossed the water. That ship was sunk, and were it not for the providence of God, he and all those on board would have died. Paul was taken to Rome, and then he was shackled to a guard. According to history, those prisoners in Rome would be shackled to a guard. Now, get the picture, please. If Paul was chained to that guard, the guard was also chained to Paul. What do you think Paul would be talking about while he was chained to that guard? History tells us that they changed the guard every 4 hours. Can you imagine Paul sitting there talking with him about how his favorite football team was going and who's going to be drafted and all that business? I doubt that he was talking about things like that. Paul was talking with him about his soul. And when the next one came on duty for 4 hours, he'd try to be talking to him about his soul. When Paul wrote to the Philippian brethren in Philippians 1, verse 12, he talked about his sufferings, but he said this on that occasion: "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel." You think about that. My circumstances have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. That's reading from the New American Standard Version. Now, you would think that Paul had really been mistreated and all of that, and he had. He had suffered greatly. But instead of complaining about the sufferings that he had had, Paul said, "I want you to know, brethren, that my suffering, the things that have happened to me, have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel." It had helped the spread of the gospel. How so? Because Paul would be teaching those who were chained to him. You remember that Paul wrote in the book of Philippians concerning the saints in Caesar's household. How were saints made in Caesar's household? Paul taught them, no doubt. When those guards were chained to Paul, they were members of the Praetorian Guard, and Paul would be teaching them, and some of them obeyed the gospel. That's how Paul's troubles had fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel. And the same thing can happen to us. Some of the things that we experience may be painful to us, but if we'll look for the way we can use those things, they can turn out for the good. And the question with us oftentimes is, why? Why did this happen to me? A better question would be, how? How can I use this to the glory of God? How can I use it to help me grow and to depend upon God more and to accomplish something good? Sometimes suffering is just a step or a bump to success. It causes us to change sometimes for the better. I wonder how many of you have heard of the boll weevil monument. Raise your hand if you've heard of the boll weevil monument. All right, that's a good number of it. Have you ever seen it? I used to preach in Enterprise. That was the first place where I worked full-time as a preacher. When I came out of college, I preached in Warrior, Alabama, but I had to work otherwise to support myself, so I taught school for 3 years and coached basketball and baseball and preached at Warrior. But I couldn't do justice to any of it. And I was making a lot of money then, about $150 a week. A lot of money. But I gave up a third of my salary to go into full-time preaching. Sometimes people say, preachers just preach for the money. They go into preaching for money. I can tell you that's not always true. I gave up a third of my salary to go into full-time preaching. I moved to Enterprise, Alabama, and I preached for the church on College Avenue. College Avenue is about 3 blocks from downtown, and Highway 84 crosses College Avenue right there. And in the center of that place, there was the Boll Weevil Monument. No matter how you came to it, you're going to have to go around that monument and you'd see it. If my information is correct, that's the only monument to a pest in the world. Now, you think about that. Why would you erect a monument to a pest? We usually erect monuments to honor brave men, good men, who've done great things. You don't erect monuments to rascals, usually, or a pest. But they erected a monument to the boll weevil. Why? They used to raise cotton around there. Cotton was king. But the boll weevils liked their cotton too. The boll weevils would eat almost half of their cotton crop, 40%. And so they were about to starve to death because the boll weevils were eating up their crop, money that would enable them to buy other things they needed. Scientists, including George Washington Carver at Tuskegee, encouraged them to turn to some other crop, raise something else. And George Washington Carver encouraged them to raise peanuts. They changed to peanuts, and it was very prosperous. They did much better with peanuts than they had done with cotton. And that area became the peanut capital of the world. Now, our church building was about 3 blocks from that monument, and between these two places, about 1.5 blocks down, was Sessions Peanut Company. That's where they brought their peanuts when they picked them. I have seen 6 or 7 or 8 trucks waiting to be unloaded with peanuts. You imagine all the peanuts that a truck would hold, little peanuts about so big. There were 6 or 7 or so trailer trucks filled with peanuts. And it became the peanut capital of the world. And those people said, you know, we ought to do something to honor these pests because they caused us to turn to peanuts. And so they decided to erect a monument there, the Boll Weevil Monument. And that suggests that sometimes something that appears to be bad can lead us to something good. Now, I think we all need to pause and look around a bit when we suffer in some way and ask, how can I use this for good? What can it do for me and for the cause of Christ? That horrible problem you've been facing may be the best thing that ever happened to you. It may be that you've been trying to grow cotton when you ought to turn to peanuts. It may be that you need to turn to something else. This particular thing may cause you great suffering. It may hurt you, but look around. There may be something else that you can do that would be better. The disappointment you're experiencing may be your boll weevil. And so affliction can be just a stepping stone to something else that's better, if we would look for it. Now, perhaps the suffering of this world was intended primarily to cause us not to be satisfied here on earth. I want you to think about that a minute. It may well be that suffering was intended, at least in part, to cause us not to be satisfied here. Suppose everything were going well with you. Suppose you have no troubles, no sorrows, no heartaches, no lost job, no problems at all. What would it do for your thinking about living here on earth forever? It'd probably make you think, well, this is pretty good. I'd just like to stay here. You might not have the desire to live for God and prepare for that wonderful world to come. And it may well be that God has allowed us to suffer some things to cause us not to be satisfied here on earth. The sorrows of this world remind us that this world is not heaven. These things help us to understand that there's a better place for us. God is preparing something better for us. Now, I know that there are some questions that we may not be able to answer about some of the questions people want to ask about suffering on earth. We may not understand everything fully. I may not be able to give you a satisfactory answer for you with your particular suffering. Now, I can answer these questions for myself. I see the hand of God in all of it. I believe in the providence of God. But it may be that you're suffering in some way, and you may not be able to see the reason for it. We may not understand why earthquakes come. That's down in the ground, you see. But did you know that there were 3 earthquakes in the last few days down in South Alabama and northern Florida? Just read about that a day or two ago. We don't hear much about those things unless a lot of people are killed in them. Why would an earthquake come? Well, they gave one reason for the possible earthquakes. Now, there may be a possible reason. They have been getting oil out of the ground down there. And they said it may be that taking that oil out of the ground has caused a vacant area down there and the earth might have moved, you see. That's a possibility. Remember, we've tried to point out the fact that sometimes man is responsible for some of the suffering, such as floods, as we talked about. Man can alter the earth by building roads and sidewalks and houses and all these things, and when the rain comes, it can't be soaked up by the earth, can't get to it. And it runs off this concrete into the rivers, and the rivers overflow and flood. Who did it? That's not God's fault, that's man's fault. So we need to look at the reasons for these things, but realize there may be a case in which we cannot explain why a certain thing happened. But great comfort lies in the fact that however these things come, or whenever they come, this world is not our home. We're just passing through. And these things are but for a moment compared to eternity. And God is preparing something better for us after a while. In Revelation 21, verse 4, John describes heaven for us. It seems as if God is waiting until near the end of the Bible to say, now let me tell you about heaven. And in Revelation 21 and 4, he says, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Think about those words. No dying, no crying, no sighing, no death, no goodbyes. You know, one of the most difficult things to experience is to have to say goodbye to those nearest and dearest on earth to you. And I'm sure that virtually everybody, if not everybody in this audience, has had that experience. One of the most difficult things for me to do that I've experienced in my preaching work is to stand beside a bed and watch a person die with a family. I remember a time when I stood there beside that bed of a dying man with the wife and the 2 children. The wife was like a grandmother to our children. And the oldest girl was a dear friend of ours from high school days at the Christian Home and Bible School in Mount Dora. She was 3 grades ahead of us, but we were all members of the same family there, very close, because the school was small, and we were friends with those older and those younger. And the youngest girl was much younger, but she was a friend as well. We stood there watching that man die. We watched him breathe and then waited. And in a brief time, he breathed again. And then in a longer period of time, he breathed again. And we waited and waited, and there was no more. His wife closed his eyelids, bent over and kissed him, and said, "Goodbye, Ray." We have to experience things like that on earth, but we won't have to do that in heaven. Here on earth, we experience these things. Doesn't that make you want to go to heaven? When you know how those things are and the sorrow they bring, doesn't it make you want to prepare to go to live with God? And so we need to realize that there are blessings in the suffering that we experience. And perhaps the greatest lesson is the fact that it reminds us that earth is not heaven. And we're going to go to a place where we won't have to cry anymore. We won't have to say goodbye anymore. There are lessons to be learned in suffering. And I wanted to spend more time with this particular aspect because I believe it is one of the greatest lessons that we need to learn. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments now. The next section is one that I want to spend time on altogether. Don't want to introduce it just yet. So we want to wait till next week to deal with that because it will be an application of the things that we've been talking about. And a reminder of some of these things. Some who are in the audience tonight haven't been here for all the lessons, and so you've missed some things. And these lessons are cumulative. They build upon each other. And if we miss some of these things, then it may not mean as much to you. And so I'd like for us to hear as much as we can about the basic points in this particular series of lessons. Any thoughts or comments? Heaven will surely be worth it all. Your mother's favorite song. It's probably the favorite song of many of us here. We love to sing those songs about heaven. We like to preach about heaven. People like to hear about heaven. I have found in my preaching that when you preach about heaven, people are more interested in that subject than any other. And when you sing songs like that, heaven will surely be worth it all. People like that. It ought to. It ought to make us think about heaven. Yes? I'm sure.
And Don, in the latter years of his life, had a lot of health issues. And he would still go to Scotland with my dad on mission campaigns. And he would be deathly sick. And yet he could get up there and preach the gospel. It's just an amazing thing to behold. That whole family, all that they went through, and yet all of the things of the Lord.
In spite of all of that suffering, he was able to do it. The McWhorters were a great example for all of us. Our time is up, but let me mention one other thing. Matthew Henry was a diligent student of the Bible and wrote a commentary on the whole Bible. I had that commentary in my library for many years. It is said that a thief once broke into his little house and stole his purse. They spoke of their billfold as their purse then. Rather than being downcast, Henry cheerfully turned and made an entry into his diary. Let me be thankful first because he had never robbed me before. Second, because although he took my purse, he did not take my life. Third, because although he took all I possessed, it was not much. And fourth, because it was I who was robbed and not I who robbed. We can always be thankful. We can always find a reason for rejoicing, even in adversity. Thank you for your attendance tonight.